Well, I hope you guys are having a great day in the life. Thought we would take a few moments today and talk about Hotchkiss artillery shells. I happen to have a few examples here. These were found at a location, well, most of these were found at a location called Hotchkiss Creek.
Yeah, how about that? Man. So that's 5 we've pulled out today.
They were some of my earliest videos finding artillery. It's exciting times for me. I think 17 Hotchkiss shells ended up coming out of that creek. So it was a really amazing sight for me, an amazing experience. But one of the interesting things about Hotchkiss Creek was nearly every single shell that came out was slightly different. Now these were all, I believe, 3.67 Hotchkiss shells. That's the diameter of them. And there were several different sizes. As we can see down here, there's a few smaller Hotchkiss shells. This is one of the smallest ones there was. And they went up all the way to like 100-pound shells. Great big coastal artillery shells. So there was a wide variety of sizes, but all of the ones that came from Hotchkiss Creek were of this size, 3.67 is what I believe it was.
Sweet.
And there's a little bit of variety here. But before we look at these shells in particular, I thought it would be good for us to talk a little bit about the nomenclature and the mechanisms of a Hotchkiss shell, how they worked, how they fired, and the different components. So for that, let's go over to the computer real quick. We'll take a quick look at what's inside these, how they work, and then we'll come back and look at these shells in particular. Okay, before we get too far into the Hotchkiss artillery projectiles, it's important that we have an understanding of the cannon technology of the day. Cannons first appeared around the 12th or 13th century and were first being used for warfare definitively in the 13th century. A cannon at that time, though, consisted essentially of a metal tube, a smooth-bored metal tube that fired a metal projectile. And the projectile would tumble out of the end of the barrel and go whichever way it went because of that smooth inner bore. Around the 1600s, rifled cannons were developed, although they weren't truly improved upon until the early 1800s. Now, a rifled cannon is what we see here on the screen. This is a model 1841 12-pounder. And the rifling that you see inside the barrel here, or these grooves, went the entire length of the barrel and they twisted as they came through the barrel. And what this did was this enabled the projectile to twist as it came out of the end of the barrel, much like a football twists when a quarterback throws a perfect spiral. And this increased the range and the accuracy of the projectiles. And so projectile manufacturers were looking for ways to enable their artillery shells to take this rifling and spin out of the barrel. This is where Hotchkiss shells come into play. In 1823, a man known as Andrew Hotchkiss was born. Now, he was born with a disability that gave him no use of his legs, and so he would push himself around in a small cart, and he began tinkering with ammunition and projectiles and armaments, and ultimately on October 16, 1855, he received a patent for an improved projectile for ordnance, and this was what became the Hotchkiss artillery shell. Now, this shell basically consisted of 3 main parts. There was a nose section, which we see here. There was a base cup section, and there was a sabot, or a lead ring here, that went around and connected the base cup and the nose section. Now, as we look here at the nose section and the base cup, we can see these small grooves here, and this enabled the lead to bite in and hold these 2 pieces together. And that lead would then take the grooves in the rifling of the cannon and spin the projectile. Now, Hotchkiss achieved this goal by creating a gap that existed between the nose and the base cup. When the lead sabot was put in place, it would leave that small gap. When the cannon fired, it would push that base cup forward, thus expanding the softer metal of the lead, and that soft metal would then take the rifle in grooves and spin out of the barrel. It's a pretty ingenious design. Unfortunately, it also created an instance where these artillery projectiles would oftentimes come apart in midair. When the base cup was forced forward, it would deform that lead so badly that as the projectile came out of the end of the barrel, the pieces would separate. Sometimes the base cup would go down and hit your own troops. A bad scenario. So let's move on. How did these shells work? How did they ignite? What were the timers or the fuses like? Oftentimes you'll hear me say I'm looking for artillery shells. It's sort of a generic term I will use. There was actually three main types of artillery projectiles. There were artillery shells, there were case shot projectiles, and there were solid shot projectiles. What we're looking at on the screen now is a case shot projectile. This was filled with small iron or lead balls and was ignited by means of a fuse, in this case a paper fuse. And as we see here along the side of this artillery shell, there are what is known as flame grooves. What these allowed for was that when the cannon fired, that initial powder charge which shot the cannon projectile out from the barrel would travel up these flame grooves and then ignite a paper fuse that was stuffed into this hole. The paper fuse would then burn its way slowly down through this small iron tube, past an iron separator plate or a pusher plate, and into the bursting charge cavity. So only this small section here was filled with powder, and that would burst, and thus dispersing the lead balls and the fragments of the artillery shell. Now, a true artillery shell is what we see here. A true artillery shell had no balls inside of it. It was simply a cavity filled with powder and designed to burst using the body of the artillery shell itself as fragments and what did the damage to the troops. Now this particular model that we're looking at has a percussion fuse. A percussion fused shell needed no flame grooves because there was no paper fuse to ignite. This percussion fuse was designed so that the shell would come down, land on its nose, and thus strike a small friction primer that was inside of the fuse, igniting the shell itself. Sort of like those little things we used to throw that looked like darts, and they'd go down and they'd hit the ground and it would set off a cap like psh. That's kind of how a percussion fuse worked. There were also lead time fuse adapters that allowed for a paper fuse. Here in this first picture we see a brass time fuse adapter. Here this is a lead fuse time adapter. We'll see an example of that when we look at my shells. And the last type is a bolt or a solid shot, which is what we see here. These were used to hit buildings, structures, other things like that. So that's a little bit of the nomenclature of what we're seeing. Another thing to note in these photos, in the bursting cavity here, you see a small nail sticking up, and that was used as part of the casting process. These were sand cast, and that little nail would help hold the sand in place when these were being cast. So just something to notice before we go over and look at the shells. Okay, now that we know a little bit about how these shells work and the different components of them, let's start in and have a look here at some of the different types of shells I found in Hotchkiss Creek. I'm going to start over here with this shell in particular. This one is a percussion shell, and we can tell that because there are no flame grooves on the body here. And this was designed to have a percussion fuse in the top, which this one has no fuse. But it was designed to have a percussion fuse in the top and would have been a shell simply filled with powder to explode. So this is one of those variety, and this is just a small sampling of the shells that were found there, just a little bit of diversity. So the next shell we come to has a lead time fuse adapter in the top of it, and most of the lead has disintegrated over the years and is gone. But inside of this one in particular, we can see the pusher plate or the iron separator plate, and we can also see the tiny tube that connected the time fuse adapter as it came down to the bottom of the bursting charge, and that kept the spark separated as it went down through that separator plate. Here we see a little bit smaller size. This was found at a different location, and this one has a nice brass time fuse adapter in the nose of it. And here we see the smallest variety of Hotchkiss shell. This is a very small one. It's also very fragile. The iron has mostly been leached out of this shell by the amount of time it spent in the water. It's mostly graphite now, very fragile. Here in the center we have two different base cups. These were the bottoms of the shell, and these would attach, let's see if I can get one to attach here, sort of like this. And then we would have had the sabot that connected these two pieces together. So that's how they connected. These base cups are different. You'll notice one has flame grooves and one doesn't have flame grooves here. And on this one without flame grooves, we can also notice that there are vestiges of the patent here. I believe it says patent October 9th, 1855 there around the rim. So pretty neat to still be able to see the writing on that on a piece of iron that came out of the water 150 some odd years after it was lost. After that we have a bolt, and this one's pretty interesting. This one's a solid bolt. This would have been used to fire at structures or possibly wagons. Mostly it was supposed to have been used for structures, but they would use it for blockhouses and wagons, and I'm sure in a pinch they used them for whatever they needed. You also notice that there is a big hollow cavity down here, and I suspect that that was to take as much of the charge as possible and hopefully throw this thing a long way. This one's pretty heavy. Really love this bolt. One of my favorites out of all of these. Here we have another lead time fuse adapter piece. This one is a beautiful example. And at the very end we have here one with a brass paper time fuse adapter, again with flame grooves. But we'll notice that there's a little bit of body contour difference to these shells. It might have just been where they were manufactured. Now on the back row I have 4 examples here that all have a very similar blown out nose, and I just wanted to speak to that briefly. If we look down inside of these shells, we can see the little iron nail protruding from the bottom. That iron nail was to hold the sand again in place as they cast these shells. There was sand actually down in the core of these as they cast them, and that's what helped give them the shape. We'll also notice that the nose is kind of blown out in a particular pattern in a way, and I believe that that is due to the pusher plate being ejected with the force of the powder coming up and hitting the bottom of that fuse adapter and then blowing the nose out of these shells. One thing you'll notice about all these with the nose blown out, they all have flame grooves, so they all were paper time fuse adapter that came down through, ignited. I suspect that pusher plate came up and blew out the weakest point of these shells, which if you look at these shells, the thinnest point of the iron is there along the top. So anyway, Hotchkiss shells are truly one of my favorite types of artillery shell to find. I found quite a few of them now. Really lucky to have these in the collection. I've never found one complete with the sabot, so I'm looking forward to finding one like that. And I've never found one of the large coastal ones. So that may be a target for me soon, is to start looking for some larger artillery pieces. These ones are neat. Some really big ones would be even neater. I'm gonna have to get on that, but there's not a lot of coastal artillery in Tennessee. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little look at the Hotchkiss shells in my collection and that you learned a little something about Civil War artillery. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and we'll see you soon. take a... I have a hound dog outside that's a little